Welcome to part one of the overview of the history of the Wye Valley Railway. My name is Kev Daniels. I'm a volunteer for the Wye Valley Greenway, which reopened part of the Wye Valley Railway as a walking and cycling route between Chepstow and Tintern in 2021. A full introduction is available at the video titled History of the Wye Valley Railway, an Introduction. Our opening slide shows the Tyddingham Tunnel, the major construction challenge on the line, which will be explained during the presentation. This history of the Wye Valley Railway is a story of outstanding engineering, tragedy, and a continuous financial struggle. We can see on the right-hand side the route of the Wye Valley Railway as built in 1876. So we left the South Wales main line at about here. Tyddingham is the first station. The dotted line represents Tyddingham Tunnel. This is Tintern, Bigswear, later named St Briavels, followed by Redbrook. They were the four stations that were built when the line was opened. But why would anyone build a railway from Chepstow to Monmouth? Not everyone was in favour of plans to build a railway. In February 1870, in a letter to the Times complaining about the turnpike between Chepstow and Monmouth, it was commented, "There are people sanguine enough to entertain visionary plans of a railway along the valley, but they may just as well amuse themselves with schemes of a balloon navigation to the moon." In contrast, in September 1874, the directors of the Wye Valley Railway made somewhat extravagant claims in the prospectus to attract investors, saying, "The railway will command a very large traffic from tourists and also in goods." Now, this particular slide gives one of the reasons to build the railway. That is, local industry to carry goods traffic. The 300-year-old wire working industry in Tintern was owned by the Duke of Beaufort, who stood to benefit from cheaper and faster transport links built at no cost to the Duke. This industry comprised a complex of forges and wire-making works for nearly 2 miles up the Angiddy Valley, starting in Tintern. Now, this slide is an iron forge at Tintern, dated 1798, probably at Pontycezan, which is situated about 1.5 miles from the River Wye, and you can see visible iron bars outside the forge. But the industry was in decline and lasted just 22 years after the line opened. The rails were then used by horse-drawn wagons for 35 years, serving the sawmills and the wood-turning works. In contrast, the Redbrook tinplate industry lasted from the opening of the railway until 1962 as a result of continuous innovation employing up to 500 people. The Wye Valley was known as the birthplace of tourism in the United Kingdom. Tintern Abbey was a major attraction. And we can see on the left a black and white poster advertising Tintern by Moonlight, an alluring title aimed to attract excursionists, as they were known, those who travelled by excursion trains. And indeed, on the 26th of May 1880, over 2,000 excursionists arrived by special train at Tintern. New technology then became available, which meant that high-quality colour-printed posters could be produced in quantity. 100 of these posters were sent to the USA to advertise first-class rail travel in the United Kingdom, and it is somewhat curious that Tintern is placed in England rather than, of course, in Wales, where it actually is. A further attempt to attract tourists was made in 1938 when the Great Western Railway published Rambles in the Wye Valley. and that included 3 circular walks from the Wye Valley Line. Route number 1 is the route from Chepstow to Tintern, Brockware and Netherhope, with the option of buying a ticket to finish the ramble at any station and then taking the train back to Chepstow. Now we have here a slide of Tintern Abbey by moonlight, which was probably produced to attract tourists to Tintern before even the railway was built. This particular engraving is from 1850. Now we're going to talk about some of the dates and events, just concentrating on a number of them. Before any railway could be built, a Railway Act had to be passed. In fact, there were 2 acts before the Wye Valley Railway started to be built. The reason there were 2 is that immediately after the first, there was a major banking collapse, investors lost confidence, and the approval ran out of validity. The Wye Valley Railway was always in financial difficulties, and receivers were appointed twice. At the time, they were trying to sell out to the Great Western Railway, but the Great Western Railway was in no hurry to buy because they could buy at a bargain price at a later date, which they did eventually in 1905, paying just 50 pence for each £20 ordinary share. So the railways may have brought prosperity to the locality, but not to ordinary shareholders. Goods and freight continued for quite some time after passenger traffic finished in 1959. And there was a saying on the railways that goods provided bread and butter, passengers only the jam. So what was the competition with the railway? I'm following now with 2 examples. Here is the first. This is the La Belle Marie, which was a steam yacht, and it was launched in 1866 and in the early years of the 20th century operated from Brockware here in this postcard. Every 2 weeks it operated, and it supplied to Bristol market produce such as apples and pears, fish, cheese, butter, corn, barley, hay, sheep and pigs, and in return coal and other commodities were brought back to Brockware, including provisions for the general store. And not just was the La Belle Marie in competition, but also, as you can tell from the 1883 Wye Valley Railway Directors Report, there was other steamships. It was said in that report that it was hoped that much, if not all, the Wye Works traffic would now be carried by the main line instead of going by water, as a large portion does at present. Steamships carried the finished products from the Wye Works. But fortunately for the Wye Valley Railway, the Redbrook tinplate industry was too far upstream to be reached by steam-powered vessels. So these steam-powered vessels were in successful competition, marking a serious setback to the Wye Valley Railway prospectors' claim that the railway will command a very high traffic in goods. Railways elsewhere dominated freight traffic because they were faster and cheaper than horse-drawing carts on very poor roads. The Wye Valley Railway failed to recognise that their assertion about commanding a very high traffic in goods did not apply to taking trade from fast and reliable steamships operating on the lower reaches of the River Wye. But this was in contrast to Trows. Trows were flat-bottomed sailing ships, and they had a much more difficult time. This lithograph is taken from 1845, and in the 1860s, 28 ships, trows and barges were owned by Llandogo families where the river was tidal. Trows could reach Brockware further upstream, but at that point, cargoes had to be broken down into smaller units, which was costly in time and money. Trows were also disadvantaged in the lower reaches as they were dependent on wind and tide and were slower than steamers. The railway killed off this way of life, and in addition, employment at the shipbuilding industry in Llandogo, Tintern and Brockware were affected as a consequence. We're now going to examine the change of route between the 1865 Act of Parliament and the 1874 Act of Parliament. If you look to the right-hand slide, you can see in the red the 1865 Act of Parliament route, and in the black is the 1874 Parliament Act route. So on the red, you can see at this point there is a tunnel, T1, and another tunnel, T2, under the Langkout Peninsula, crosses the Livox Peninsula and carries on the Welsh side up to Tintern. In contrast, the 1874 Act went through a single tunnel at this point, Tiddingham, up this side of the English side of the River Wye, went through a short tunnel just before Tintern, across the river, and at Tintern it joined the same route as the 1865 Act of Parliament route. And you can see on the left hand side, this is the actual plan deposited for the 1865 route. And if you look at this point and this point, they are at a point where the first tunnel actually left the cliffside and re-entered it about 150 metres further on. Now, the reasons for this change of route are not altogether clear. If you look on the next slide, you can see what was actually happening. This is Winter's Leap, from those who know the area. And at this point, the first tunnel left the cliffside, carried across a viaduct and re-entered the cliffside here. Now, this viaduct would not have been too great a challenge for Victorian railway engineers, and indeed would have given spectacular views of the local scenery. But in trying to determine why this change of route happened, we have to take into account that tunnel construction was by far the most expensive part of building a railway. And by this reckoning, the 1874 route was the most expensive, as the total tunnel length was some 35% longer than the 1865 route. So, a director's report at the time stated that the revised route was probably cheaper, but this does not seem to make sense. The decision may have been influenced by an objection in a parliamentary committee to the 1865 route that trains could affect the stability of Tintern Abbey, and at the time this objection was dismissed by the Duke of Beaufort's solicitors. But this slide shows the abbey, and from that you can imagine that the upper area here would have been very vulnerable, only being kept in place by a thin layer of mortar, and a tremble at ground level could have been magnified at the top of the building. So you can imagine that if the objectors were better organised in 1874, they could sway the parliamentary committee, and so perhaps in 1874 the directors did not want to run the risk of antagonising the objectors, with the result of the possibility that the Act would not be passed in Parliament, but instead they antagonised the Duke of Beaufort, who extracted a heavy price in his demand for an exclusive use of a branch line to the Wye Works.